As I mentioned last class, the first civilization arose in Mesopotamia. A close second was the civilization in Egypt, which actually unified before Sargon first unified Mesopotamia. Egypt would also have a significantly higher degree of stability than its contemporary Mesopotamian civilizations. Part of the reason for this unity and stability is Egypt's geography, particularly the long, narrow Nile River, which is surrounded by deserts. You can really see the divide between the fertile river and its immediate banks and the barrenness of the surrounding desert in the Google Earth photo that I've put up on this page. It is hard to invade Egypt across these formidable desert borders. Therefore, Egypt only had to guard its northern delta region that runs into the Mediterranean, and its southern frontier near the upper reaches of the river. Ancient Egyptian history covers 3,000 years and consists of 31 royal dynasties, or related royal families. Since Egyptian history is so long and is largely continuous, archaeologists and historians have divided Egyptian history into 6 major periods: the Archaic, the Old Kingdom, the First Intermediate Period, the Middle Kingdom, the Second Intermediate Period, and the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom came to an end with the foreign invasions of the Assyrian Empire, which will be discussed in a later lecture. But ultimately, the Egyptian dynastic tradition will be maintained all the way down to Cleopatra, who finally lost Egypt to Rome in 30 BC. All of the dates given in Egyptian history must be approximate, both because of the relative imprecision of archaeological dating, but also because of major disagreements among historians. Egyptian kings are generally known as pharaohs, which means great house in ancient Egyptian. This is a reference to magnificent royal palaces in which these rulers lived. Technically, the term is only valid beginning in the New Kingdom, but since its use is so prolific, I may use the term anachronistically from time to time. Unlike Mesopotamia, where it is known that Sargon was the first to unite the independent Sumerian cities, in Egypt, the man to first unite the river valley is largely surrounded in myth and mystery. Nevertheless, the first ruler of the first dynasty is generally considered to be a man named Narmer, who united the villages that had cropped up along the Nile by military force, and is thus the founder of the first dynasty. The first and second dynasties are together compose the Archaic, or early dynastic period, which runs from 3100 to 2700 BC. Part of the reason for this unification was the regular and gentle flooding of the Nile, which is quite different from the unpredictable and violent flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates. It should be noted that Sumerians believed in violent, vengeful, and capricious gods, and they lived in an area with spontaneous violent flooding. The Egyptians lived in an area with regular, predictable, and controllable flooding, and would develop a substantially more optimistic religious attitude. Egyptian priests were able to predict when the flood would happen, so they could prepare to plant their crops to take advantage of the floodwater. I've provided a photograph of flooded Egyptian fields to show how the Egyptian farmers used the Nile's water to irrigate their fields. Such centralized control led to an efficient agricultural policy whose prosperity strengthened the political, economic, and religious aura of the pharaoh. The Old Kingdom succeeded the Archaic period and encompassed the 3rd through the 6th dynasties, lasting from 2700 to 2200 BC. One of the key features of the Old Kingdom was the power of the pharaohs, which greatly expanded. Not content with standing as the representative of the gods, as was the case in Mesopotamia, Egyptian pharaohs proclaimed themselves to be gods. Thus, Egyptian government became a theocracy. As such, the entire country was the pharaoh's as a personal possession. It was to be run to his benefit. During this period, the pharaohs exercised quite a bit of power over the Egyptian nobility and priesthood, more so than in other periods of Egyptian history. The Great Pyramids were constructed during the Old Kingdom, during the 4th dynasty, particularly at Giza, and the photos on this page are of some of the pyramids that still stand at Giza. These structures served as tombs for the pharaoh and his family, and were designed to provide for their needs in the afterlife. Now, during the Old Kingdom, only the pharaoh and his household were thought to be immortal. This belief led to the practice of mummification, to preserve the pharaoh's body as well as possible, since it would be needed in the afterlife. These mummies did their job, and the pharaoh's corpses are still relatively well conserved, as you can see in this photo. The mummies, once wrapped, were placed inside an ornate sarcophagus before being placed inside a pyramid, and I provided you with an image of one of these sarcophagi here. Around 2200 BC, the power of the pharaohs declined precipitously, and the nobility who administered local districts took power. These districts were known as nomes, and the administrators were nomarchs. This period of Egyptian history is known as the First Intermediate Period, since there was no centralized control under the pharaohs. As a result, this period saw a number of civil wars. Since the pharaohs did not have the power to effectively coordinate the running of the kingdom's agriculture, food output also declined, leading to economic hardship and famine. From the years 2050 to 1700, the 11th and 12th dynasties restored centralized government. These dynasties carried out some ambitious public works programs, including a canal that linked the Nile River to the Red Sea. This stability was not to last, however, as Egypt faced foreign invasion. These invaders are largely unknown to us apart from the name given to them by the Egyptians themselves, the Hyksos, or foreigners. The Hyksos people came from Palestine and invaded the Nile Delta. They overcame the defenses of the Middle Kingdom with their horse-drawn chariots. The Second Intermediate Period, which lasted from 1700 to 1550, therefore, was a period of foreign Hyksos domination. The Hyksos never governed all of the Middle Kingdom. They controlled the Nile Delta, but never extended control down to the headwaters of the Nile in the south. Ultimately, an Egyptian nobleman named Ahmose drove out the Hyksos and began the 18th dynasty. The ouster of the Hyksos led to the establishment of the New Kingdom, which would encompass the 18th through 20th dynasties and last from about 1550 to 1100 BC. During the New Kingdom, Egypt's pharaohs pursued an active foreign policy, largely out of a desire to prevent a Hyksos repeat. As you can see on the map, Egypt extended south along the Nile River deep into Africa, as well as north across the Sinai Peninsula into Palestine, Syria, and Anatolia. By expanding this far, however, the Egyptians encountered the Hittites, who were expanding into the same area. The Hittite-Egyptian wars were epic, pitting two empires against each other. Perhaps the most famous of their battles was the Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BC. So many battles were fought in this general vicinity over the following centuries that the area became known as Armageddon, with apocalyptic overtones. Neither side won these wars, but in 1274, after neither side could win the Battle of Kadesh, the two sides agreed to a peace treaty, the world's first. Most of the famous pharaohs that we remember today ruled during the New Kingdom, including Ahmose I, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, or King Tut, and Ramses II. Hatshepsut deserves a special mention, since she was a successful female pharaoh. When her husband died, she proclaimed herself pharaoh, while her stepson was too young to rule, and would eventually become the longest-ruling native Egyptian female. She commissioned hundreds of building projects throughout Egypt, especially her own temple complex at Deir el-Bahri. The Egyptians, like the Mesopotamians, were polytheists, but Egyptian anthropomorphism was less distinct. Many Egyptian gods combined human features with animal ones. Here are some examples. Anubis, the god of the dead, had a human body, but a jackal's head. Ra, the sun god, had a human body with a hawk's head. I've also previously mentioned that the Egyptians considered their pharaoh to be a god, unlike the Mesopotamians, who considered their ruler to be a representative of the god. Egyptians believed that their pharaohs possessed ma'at, which can be translated as truth or justice. It was the possession of this ma'at that gave the pharaoh his divinity, but the pharaoh had to rule in accordance with ma'at, or else the Nile would cease to flood, a disaster for the entire country. In addition, the Egyptians practiced syncretism, or the mixing of religious elements. In the case of the Egyptians, over time, two distinct gods would be merged together into a single deity with different aspects. Here's an example. Ra was the sun god, and Ammon was a fertility god who was often depicted as a ram. Over time, Egyptians began to worship Ammon-Ra, and he became the chief of the gods and the patron of Egypt. I've also already mentioned the different attitudes that the Egyptians had regarding religion when compared to the Sumerians. The Sumerians did not look forward to the afterlife, but Egyptians believed in a happy immortality. At first, during the Old Kingdom, only the pharaoh and the nobility could achieve immortality, but this was later extended to all. Egyptians tried to preserve their bodies through mummification in order to give their souls a body in their afterlife. The Egyptian word for soul is ka. Egyptians believed that when someone died, his or her soul had to travel to the Hall of Judgment. On their way, the soul could be attacked by evil demons. As a result, it was important to provide the soul with the texts of spells that could protect the soul. Once at the Hall of Judgment, the god Osiris would weigh the soul, and if it was virtuous, based upon how one acted on earth, it could proceed into heaven, a place of eternal happiness. If the soul was not virtuous, then it would be consumed by a vicious monster known as the Destroyer of Souls. All of these beliefs were contained in the Egyptian text known as the Book of the Dead. Most New Kingdom pharaohs were most interested in foreign policy and expanding Egypt's borders. An important exception to this was Amenhotep IV, who ruled between 1375 and 1358 BC, and he initiated the Amarna period. This is called the Amarna period because the evidence that was found about these reforms was discovered only in the 1800s AD in the modern Egyptian city of Amarna. Amenhotep focused his reign on religious reforms and changed his name to Akhenaten to show his devotion to the god Aten. Now Aten was the actual disk of the sun, as opposed to the god of the sun who was Ra or Amun-Ra. Akhenaten only worshipped Aten, and his new name even meant devotion to Aten. Akhenaten ended the worship of other gods, and even moved the capital of Egypt away from Thebes to a new city dedicated to Aten, which he named Akhetaten, which is near present-day Amarna. By creating new religious practices, he initiated what is perhaps the first monotheistic religion. But he also took power away from the priests of the old gods, especially the priests of Amun. These priests resented their loss of power, and compelled his successor to go back to the old gods after Akhenaten died. The priests did such a good job of erasing this painful memory that the very fact of this brief monotheistic period was unknown until the 1800s. The Egyptian historical record didn't even use his name, simply referred to Akhenaten as the enemy. The discovery of the religious reforms of this period also helps to explain a brief change in artistic style. During the Amarna period, sculptures show a more relaxed, realistic human body, as opposed to the stiff, formal statues of previous periods. After the reforms were repealed, artists returned to the old styles, but there was a brief period, unexplained until relatively recently, of artistic experimentation. Egyptian society was very structured, but surprisingly for this time period, men and women possessed relatively equal legal rights. Women in ancient Egypt had more rights than in any other ancient civilization. For example, women could not be forced into a marriage against their will. They could work outside the home and even run their own businesses. They could also own, buy, and sell property. They could even leave their property to whomever they desired in their wills, even to their daughters. Women in Egypt could also initiate a divorce, and then they could choose to get remarried, or they could choose to remain single. Egypt's monumental architecture clearly reflects their concern with the afterlife, and it emphasizes the importance of religion. As I've already discussed, the most impressive remainders of ancient Egypt are the pyramids, which were divine royal tombs. Later Egyptian pharaohs built magnificent subterranean tombs built into mountains at the Valley of the Kings at Thebes. Perhaps the most famous Egyptian tomb, that of King Tut, was found here in 1922. Other pharaohs built giant temple complexes that doubled as tombs, such as Hatshepsut's temple at Bar al-Bahri, which is pictured here in the upper left. Other temples were built at Karnak and Luxor. Karnak is in the lower left of the screen, and the upper right shows Ramses II tomb. These temples are covered with sculptures, paintings, and writing. Egyptian writing was called hieroglyphics by the Greeks, which means sacred writings, and an example of hieroglyphics is included on the lower right-hand part of your screen. These hieroglyphics were a form of pictograph. Hieroglyphics were used on pharaohs' tombs, sacred texts, and official government records. While hieroglyphics were often carved into stone, for government records they were also written on papyrus. from which we derive the word paper. Papyrus is formed by slicing over reeds and pasting them together into long sheets that naturally curled into scrolls. Unfortunately, most of these papyrus scrolls have disintegrated over time, since they are made out of plant material. Those surviving scrolls, however, reveal much about Egyptian civilization. The Egyptians used a 12-month, 30-day calendar, with 5 days added at the end of every year. The Egyptians even realized that the year is slightly longer than 365 days, and began in the hundreds BC to include leap years to correct their calendars. It is unclear whether hieroglyphics are derived from cuneiform or whether they developed independently. It used to be believed that the Egyptians learned to write from Mesopotamians, but it has now been established that the Egyptians were writing as long ago as 3000 BC, and hieroglyphics may have developed independently.